Lauren Elkin's essays have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times Book Review, Frieze, and the Times Literary Supplement, and she is contributing editor at The White Review. A native New Yorker, she moved to Paris in 2004, currently living on the right bank after years on the left. She can generally be found ambling around Belleville, which is where we are right now, to talk about Flaneuse. Women walk the city in Paris, New York, Tokyo, Venice, and London. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming to my house to do it.
It's a pleasure. Flaneuse has been described as a memoir, a history, a biography, social commentary, travel writing, literary criticism. So that gives the bookseller a bit of a challenge as to where to put it.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to incorporate all these different types of writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it just sort of came out that way. It was less of a conscious choice and more just sort of giving myself permission to follow the narrative where it went. So I guess that it might be related to the fact that it's a book about wandering in cities. I mean, that's the sort of, obvious answer is like, well, if the book is about wandering aimlessly, perhaps the narrative should sort of digress aimlessly, which is not entirely accurate reflection of the writing process and the revision process. There was a real sense of every chapter having its own kind of focus. So there was a city and a major figure in most cases, and then a kind of key that I would cast it in. So like the idea of being stuck inside in Tokyo, or the idea of obedience in Venice, or revolution in the second George Sand chapter. So there is a sense that it could, because I gave myself permission to just meander, just turn into a collection of like things that Lauren thinks are interesting. But I had to be really careful in the writing and the revising to kind of give it attention, give it a shape, make it feel as if it were sort of accumulating into something in addition to being, a sort of meander through a topic.
The term flâneur has been defined as an idler, a dawdling observer usually found in cities. Perhaps you could expand on that a bit and also talk to us about what are the benefits of being a flâneur.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so the term flâneur is one that I think is kind of a power trope in the way that we talk about the city. I mean, if you just look on Twitter at a kind of random sampling of urban Twitter accounts, you'll find a lot of the time people sort of self-identifying as a flâneur. Flâneur likes cupcakes, like that sort of, very millennial relationship to the city and to what we do in the city. I think it captures a way that we like to think about being curious about the city, and maybe there's a sort of intellectual, like anti-capitalist idea behind our taking up of the flâneur, this idea that we're not going to be subject to the clock or to appointments, we're just going to sort of take the day as it comes. So I think there is something very attractive about the idea of the flâneur. There's, at the same time, this might speak to the second half of your question, the benefits of being a flâneur. There is this sense that some people have access to that kind of mode of being in the city that other people don't. And for the purposes of my book, I was drawing the line between men and women, or men sort of historically having more access to the city in a kind of casual way than women have historically had.
Plus they've got more money. You have to have money to be
exactly.
able to do that.
So right? I think that's the, I drew the split male-female because of this historic figure of the flâneur, but I think there are all sorts of other sort of intersectional ways in which you could say, like, it's a question of money, it's a question of ability, it's a question of, race. There are all sorts of ways in which the way that we present in the city allows us to navigate it more or less unhampered, or allows us to kind of disappear into the crowd. So that's a benefit of being a flâneur, I think, is you can sort of disappear into the crowd, be, the agent of the gaze rather than the object of the gaze, just sort of take it all in, go wherever you want, have a mostly unharassed experience of the city. And that's not what sort of the female experience of the city has always been.
Which is a kind of a charged term right now, harassment.
Yes, it is. And in writing the book, I actually began with this whole sort of treatise about street harassment in the introduction that included a sort of proto-Me Too list of all the times when me or my friends had been attacked in the city. It was like a diatribe And I ended up cutting it because it felt like, I don't know, that's not really what the book was going to be about after all. Like, I wanted it to be a kind of celebration of the ways in which cities have been really creative places for women to engage with, not free from risk. And I think that's clear throughout the various chapters that there are women, you know, taking certain risks and engaging with the cities the way they do on foot. But yeah, I ended up not feeling like I wanted to have a big chapter about street harassment and how horrible cities are for women, because that's very, you could just go on the internet and Google street harassment and you'll see a lot about that. But maybe there's this untold story, or now I've started trying to tell the story of ways in which cities have been places of, you know, I don't know, creativity and like independence and self-actualization for women, in spite of the fact that there are also these sort of ways in which the city doesn't open itself up to us the way it does for a male flâneur.
You talk about, just to quote you here, a determined, resourceful woman keenly attuned to the creative potential of the city and the liberating possibilities of a good walk. And so that begs the question, first of all, what is the creative potential of a city, and what are liberating possibilities?
I think the creative potential of a city probably depends on who you are and what kind of city you like. I am a native New Yorker and an adopted Parisian, and so for me, a city is really defined by, you know, as Jane Jacobs said in her sort of wonderful ode to the West Village, you need to have like the ballet of the sidewalk, lots of people coming and going in a sort of, I don't know, improvised choreography, this sense that there's drama on the street and we're all sort of taking part in it, or we're keeping eyes on the street, and so there's a sense in which we're looking out for each other. So for me, I need to be in a city that has that kind of feeling too, where people walking around, there's lots of like shops and, I don't know, people idling, people on the sidewalk. It's hard to describe what that kind of essential thing is that makes a city creatively potent for me. There are cities where I feel that less, and I didn't write about those in the book, but they're cities that, you know, like Los Angeles, I went to a really long time ago. I haven't been back in adulthood, but I'm really curious to get back to it, because I remember feeling like it's just a car culture and it didn't interest me very much, but I have a lot of friends who live out there and say, like, you know, there is a way in which it's so atmospheric. There is this sense of like, you do need a car in certain places, and other places you don't. But even in the places where you have a car, like Will Self was telling me how much he loves to walk in LA, even though it's not a walking culture, it still has like something to it.
You talk about the creative potential, attuned to the creative potential of the city. Does that make you more creative? Or what does it do?
I think that, so cities, in this sense of like potentiality as being like a power contained in the city that you can tap into. And I think that it's not, like, as I was saying, like, I could go to LA and not like tap into the creative potential of the city. I think that I don't want to be really snobbish about, you know, cities that I don't like, because lots of other people do. Like Tokyo, I read about really hating it at the beginning and not seeing a way to tap into the creative potential of the city, not seeing a way to sort of connect up what makes me really excited to walk around or to read about the city's history or to write about the city or engage with it in some kind of creative way. As a writer and a reader, that's how I engage creatively.
Yeah.
But other people do. So it's a question of, whether or not cities can awaken that desire to create in us, or whether or not we can understand how that city is powerful or I mean, the Tokyo chapter really, it sits in the middle of the book. And I wanted to include it because it seemed important to write about a city that was challenging for me to walk in. Not that I think it's challenging for everyone to walk in, but that when I got there, it was very surprising and disappointing and made a stark contrast with Paris, which is a place that I love and where I would have preferred to stay, but for various reasons I ended up going to Tokyo. And so I felt it was important to include the sort of narrative of how when I got there, I loathed it and I couldn't figure out a way to like enjoy it, and it seemed like all around me all these other people were you know, singing its praises, like it's this great world capital, and I was like, it just seems so ugly and confining
and impersonal.
Exactly. But then by the end of the time that I spent there, I sort of came to understand the ways in which the relationship I was in, which was providing the framework, both the reason for my being there and the frame through which I was seeing the city, was really the thing that was holding me back, and it was trying to see the world through my ex's eyes or through his sort of frames of reference that meant I couldn't sort of understand Tokyo or, get to grips with Tokyo. And as I drifted away from him and sort of focused on my relationship with the city, I was a lot happier there and got more into it. So now I can't wait to go back to Tokyo.
So it's almost like as you're sort of breaking away from your ex, you're able to fall in love with the city.
Yeah, exactly.
The next guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I definitely have a that kind of relationship to cities. Or there was a period of time when it felt like I was married to Paris, but I was cheating on Paris with London. Because I would go to London, every so often. And now I've just renewed my commitment to Paris. And yeah, I've left lots of guys because they didn't want to live here or left here. Or, yeah, it's always been Paris over a guy for a long time.
The flâneur was born in 19th century Paris. Among the boulevards and arcades of Haussmann's newly redesigned city. So what about Samuel Johnson and the poet, I think it's Richard Savage? They used to go strolling all night long all around London, all the time.
True. Yeah, I think that there's a specific history of flânerie in Paris that, you can trace back to the arcades. Even before the arcades, it really sort of gets codified at that moment in the mid-19th century. But that has to do a lot with the modernizing city and with the invention of spaces in which to walk, where you'd be safe from like horses and carriages and horse dung and people tipping feces out their window. But yeah, that doesn't mean that it hasn't existed in other cities. But that kind of strolling, I think, has its own flavor in London. I mean, it's not my field. I don't know enough about London, before the 20th century. So it feels like the way that Paris is modernizing and creating these spaces for people to walk seems to coincide with the usage of the term flâneur and the term flânerie in really specific ways. But I don't know what the history of strolling is in London.
Yeah, this is another interesting point. With the flâneur, the crowd is his domain. He's a man of means and leisure, not involved. He's not involved. He's detached and perceptive, has a perceptive eye. So if the crowd is his domain, and yet he's not involved and he's detached, so how do you wed those two?
Yeah, this is going back to like the sort of paradox of modernity and what it is to be an individual in the city. You see this in Georg Simmel, you see it in Baudelaire, this sense of being threatened by the anonymity of the city. It's like this ocean that threatens to swallow you up. But then that also, the same feeling that the city invites you to be very much yourself, to be very much an individual. Simmel writes elsewhere about fashion and the paradox of fashion being about having to fit in and be wearing what's fashionable, what's stylish, but also at the same time the obligation to be like, to have your own style that's distinct from anyone else's. So I think that's sort of what Simmel and Baudelaire and all these sort of 19th century or early 20th century observers of the city are picking up on, the sense that you can feel very alone in the city and also be surrounded by people. It's less a question of reconciling these two ideas and more a question of, accepting that that's just what it means to live in a city, to always be alone, but to always be surrounded, or to feel part, as I wrote about in the George Sand chapter, of this these amazing moments of collective revolt or collective rejoicing, but you're sort of irrevocably linked to other people in a way that you sort of aren't aware of when you're not in the sort of urban throng.
You grew up in the suburbs.
Yes, exactly.
In Long Island, the suburbs are sort of the opposite of the city in that they're so homogenous and car-oriented and strip malls. You basically, it's like you rebelled against that, but you just wanted to get the hell away from that.
Yeah. I think that is what sensitized me to the importance of the collective, the fact that I grew up in a place where everyone was atomized in their own little house. And, you just take the car from your house to school, or, you take the bus from the house to school, but your car to go shopping or your car to go wherever. Everyone's in their own little bubble with their own music playing or their own conversation. No one takes public transport. There's much less of a sense of accidental encounters. You might run into someone like at the butcher. And I don't want to detract from the fact that, to the people who live in them, these do feel like communities. They're just they're differently formed communities than what I have in the city. But it still felt to me, like, living in the suburbs was ultimately about living for yourself and your family and not really caring that much about the people around you. I think that's why in America you see, because most people live in suburban communities, you see...
To build your own castle.
Yeah, exactly. That sense of individualism, that like pioneering sense of like, I'm going to look after me and my family, and, you know, fuck the other guy. This, and why people throw themselves into the church, because the church is like where they have their community and they remember, oh, right, communities are great. We might be living in our atomized houses with our little cars taking us, protecting us from the world. But actually it's really nice to come together in these ways. So I think that the way that people have patterned their lives in America, I find like really just wasn't my cup of tea. And I think that it does lead to very questionable Republican style individualism and a rejection of the idea that we need to look out for each other. There has, you know, the idea of the social safety net, I think is important to people on the left, because people on the left tend to live in cities and are, you know, faced with people's lives that are not like their own, and
it's right in their face, isn't
yeah,
it?
Exactly, yeah.
On their doorstep.
So I think we feel responsible for each other in a way that you can just forget about when you're coming and going between, you know, your home and your office and your car.
Yeah. Your father is an architect.
Yeah.
Did you absorb some of his appreciation for man-made surroundings?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I just have always been aware of the fact that the environment around me was built by someone like my dad. So I think when you come into the world, or when your view of the world is shaped by that idea that things are constructed, it gives you a kind of obvious affinity for the built environment and an interest in the way that things are put together, but also a kind of built-in sense that like there are people who determined that we should live this way, and they're fallible, and perhaps we can question them and think about other ways we might want to live.
Let's get back to masculine privilege. This is probably the most quoted line from the book. As if a penis...
Is that the most quoted line?
I'm sure, yeah. I've seen it quoted in almost every review.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
As if a penis were a requisite walking privilege like a cane. You say that most French dictionaries don't even include flâneuse. Women were oppressed in cities. And one of the sort of definitions of a flâneur is connected to invisibility and the fact that it was difficult for women to be invisible due to societal surveillance and street harassment. So when did all of that change then?
I think you start to see a really key moment of transformation towards the end of the 19th century with the rise of the department store, for instance, which is a key flashpoint in talking about access to the city or visibility within the city. Because, for instance, the sort of classical idea of the flâneur would have that he is distinct from the city and not uninvested, but that he's not taking part in it. He's an observer. He's definitely not shopping. He's not like out to acquire or to have sort of financial transactions. He's not a dandy. He's not, you know, interested in having people be impressed by what he's wearing. He's like the epitome of almost the ghost in the city who slips by unnoticed. And then women, as they are sort of invited into the public sphere through the rise of the department store, of the cinema, of sort of cafes where you could go, like tea houses, you know, that were sort of, you know, there have always been cafes in Paris, but, you know, only a certain kind of woman would go and sit in one alone or with a man and drink or smoke. But so as that becomes more socially acceptable, you start to see just a variety of different ways to engage with the city that to my mind are still kind of growing out of the gaze of the flâneur, the interest in what's happening. What I'm trying to say is that there's this way in which the flâneur we think of as being there but unseen, and definitely not like buying and selling, and that women, once they've entered public space, are there because there are these new ways of buying and selling, or these ways of consuming culture, taking part in culture, and they're being invited into that sort of urban spectacle in a way that allows them to be agents of the gaze as well as objects of the gaze. For me, it comes back to that John Berger quote, is it men act and women appear, or women watch themselves appearing? That the privilege of the flâneur is that he's allowed to sort of be what he wants, but women are slotted into one of two categories. Are you watcher, or are you being watched? Or are you watching yourself being watched? So it just becomes a lot more complicated, I guess, and fraught for a woman in public space than it is for a man. But I should say, I mean, sort of the thing that has me like bracketing in my mind everything that I'm saying is that the flâneur himself, as I say in the book, is, how to say it, like he's a cipher. He's a figure who arises out of 19th century like newspapers, columns in newspapers, cartoons, novels, and he means something different to different writers at different moments. So there's, I think, like the Balzac flâneur is like a desperate man as well as an idle one. Flaubert's flâneur is very often the artist who's sort of, you know, out in the city taking notes and then going home to write his magnum opus. There is this sense that Baudelaire's flâneur, who's the, you know, the artist of modern life, who's, you know, Constantin Guis taking all of these notes and making all of these quickly drawn portraits, is not necessarily the same flâneur who appears in different accounts over the course of like 100 years. So it seemed to me that the flâneur himself was an unstable figure. We couldn't really agree on what he was. Therefore, we couldn't say there could be no female version of a flâneur because we didn't even know what we were negating anyway or feminizing anyway. So it seemed much more useful to me to just cut the whole conversation about the flâneuse free from the idea of the flâneur and invent her as you know, her own sort of entity, like women walking in the city, women practicing flânerie would be a flâneuse. So it is a female version of a flâneur, but it's not a woman doing the things that a man does. It's a woman doing the things that she wants to do in the city.
Proust talks about the female counterpart as the passante.
Yeah, that's fine, and you know, worthwhile and interesting and everything, but it's like, what is she passing? It still feels like it's rooted in Proust's perspective, which is, you know, of course, a masculine perspective, even if, you know, this idea of masculinity is itself unstable. I don't mean to like conjure up Proust as like this stable male watcher, but it's still a perspective other than the, you know, the woman isn't the passante. Like, what is she passing? Like, she's the subject, not the thing that you observe passing by something else. So I guess that's, you know, and it's kind of rooted in that Baudelaire poem à une passante, which is very much about, you know, Baudelaire or his narrative double, like watching this mysterious woman, you know, come and go in the city, and he doesn't speak to her. She's just this like woman who mystifies him. She doesn't have any specific life of her own or interior mind or whatever. It's funny, we're hearing so much about this New Yorker short story Cat Person. Have you read it?
Mm-mm.
It's worth looking at. It's kind of like written with incredible precision, but it's about sex from the perspective of this 20-year-old girl and how confused she is, and she's sort of, you know, I don't know, figuring things out for herself over the course of this encounter that she has with this guy. And a lot of people have been outraged by the fact that the guy we don't know, she's sort of mean about him. She says some not nice things about his body and how like he's kind of a loser in certain ways. And people have said like this, she's so mean to this guy, this poor guy. And the BBC went and had like commissioned someone to write a satire from the guy's perspective. And it's like, but the whole point was that for once we had a perspective from a young woman's point of view. You just don't hear about that. Young women are the like
kind of an honest
things.
Perspective too.
Yeah, exactly.
That was, well, brutally honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So we really didn't need the guy's perspective because we could just look at the history of Western literature for the guy's perspective. Mm-hmm. For once we had, you know, the women's perspective. So anyway, it's worth looking at that short story, I think, on this question.
Almost every conversation on the face of the planet these days includes Donald Trump in it. So why don't we just look at the sort of reaction to Trump being elected and that huge women's march. They weren't really being flâneurs, though. They had an objective. Yes,
definitely. So in my sort of reading of the Flâneuse, I'm trying to push this idea, or not push it, but sort of explore all of the different implications for what it means to be a woman walking in the city. And I think a pretty far out interpretation of it is political walking, or walking in a group. So that the sort of idea behind the political march is visibility, this idea that we are going to manifest ourselves publicly and say, we are not Russian bots pretending to be Nebraskan housewives. We are people. This is an idea that we're marching in favor of, or we're protesting this other idea about the way that we should live our lives. So it seems like with the political march, we're very far from the idea of the flâneur going for a stroll with nothing particular to do. But we are in the realm of flâneuserie, which is women making themselves visible on the city streets.
Taking back the streets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Reclaiming them. So I think that falls under the heading of the Flâneuse is not just a female version of a flâneur. Sometimes when women walk in the city, it is with great purpose. There's a chapter on Martha Gellhorn towards the end of the book where she's walking around the streets of Madrid during the Spanish Civil War, interviewing people to say, like, you know, what she has in mind, that she will write an article on the basis of what they tell her, but she's sort of getting a sense of what people are living through in wartime through that sort of act of flâneuserie, or, you know.
Let's say she had an objective there, so that's it's not really flâneuse.
It is, because it's a woman out on the city streets, like, you know, tapping the creative potential of the city. So it's not it's not what the flâneur does in that sort of classical sense. But I guess my argument is that if we can't agree on what the flâneur is doing, because Flaubert's artistic flâneur is like taking notes and then going home and writing his novel, then I think it gives us, not that we need permission, but, you know, it gives us permission to open up the idea of what it can be to walk in the city. Sometimes walking aimlessly in the city can turn into something else, or can give you the material that you want to go and do something much more political or more artistic. So yeah, I loved the Women's March. That was very exciting. Yeah, that was like huge, the apotheosis of my book for me. It was like, look at these millions of women walking in the city streets, telling this man, you know, we are watching you and we are here, and one misstep and we'll be out here again. And I mean, I don't know, I wrote an article about it for The Pool where I recalled the Women's March on Versailles, which was a real turning point in the French Revolution. I mean, the storming of the Bastille was fine, but they only saved or freed 4 or 5 people or something. But the storming of the Women's March on Versailles, they ended up getting the Queen and the King to come back to Paris with them. So, you know.
And to sign.
Yeah, exactly. Document. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, like, let us not underestimate. There's a quote from Flaubert that I use as the epigraph to one of the chapters. It's like 40,000 citizenesses could make the Hôtel de Ville tremble. So yeah, Trump should reread his Flaubert, quote unquote, reread.
Well, they say black women beat Roy Moore.
Yeah, exactly. So. Thank you to them. Well, I guess Alabama thanks them, and then the country at one remove from that.
You intersperse opinion and experience, the opinion and experience of a sorority of Flâneuses, with portraits of, among others, Jean Rhys, Virginia Woolf, Martha Gellhorn, as you mentioned, and George Sand. And with George Sand, she took to cross-dressing to aid mobility and invisibility, even though it was illegal. That's pretty impressive commitment to
to walking.
Yeah,
exactly. She's amazing. In that George Sand chapter, because there are 2 of them, I was trying to get to grips with Sand as cross-dresser and city walker in a way that didn't fall yet again into the trap of like, oh, George Sand, she liked to dress like a man and smoke cigarettes, like the kind of myth of it, you know, affair with Chopin that we've seen in a bunch of like movies about her life. It just felt like, because it was a chapter about revolution and I was trying to understand like the spirit of the streets of Paris that can make people just go from one day to the next, like doing their job to building a barricade. I was trying to understand the way that a very daily life of the streets can make you do things that you wouldn't normally do, or take a risk that might seem outsized to you. So it felt important in getting to grips with Sand as like a real flesh and blood person, not just a myth, to understand why, like, what was her physical experience of life in the city that led her to want to wear men's clothes and do all of the other things that she's so famous for doing. So it felt like, the walking and the wearing men's shoes were really, she says it herself, they're tied together, and that's what, that kind of freedom that she's able to taste is what gives her even more of a taste to take the risks that she takes in her life and in her writing.
Homosexuality was illegal, but I had no idea that cross-dressing was illegal.
Yeah, exactly. You had to get like permission from the city if you wanted to wear trousers if you were a man. So,
if you were a woman.
Yeah, sorry, if you were a woman. Yeah.
That's bizarre, isn't it?
I know, yeah.
Huh. And then, of course, there's lower-class women prostitutes who enjoyed a certain kind of invisibility.
But I think they were really circumscribed. I mean, so to go back just to this idea of how bizarre it was that it was illegal for women to wear trousers. This is a culture that has a lot invested in everyone, France still does, in everyone sort of performing their own gender role in a really circumscribed and socially approved way. So women had to be women and wear skirts, and like it's just very confusing if they're wearing trousers, like it's like threatening to the very fabric of French society. So prostitutes, again in the 19th century, start to be tracked and registered, assigned certain kinds of clothing and certain neighborhoods where they could, for the ones that walked, you could only like walk between here and here, but not like get off your beat. So there's this sense that there are certain parts of the city that are approved for loose women to wander.
Red light district.
Yeah, exactly. But they couldn't just go wherever they wanted, and they couldn't wear whatever they wanted. And they had to go regularly for their medical checkups. They had to be sort of registered in this book, which doesn't mean that there weren't women who were living off the grid. There were. But, mostly this idea of the prostitute as someone who had the run of the city. By the 19th century, when the flâneur is really codified as a figure, she's also being codified as a very specific, her sort of freedom in the city as being freedom, quote unquote, such as it was, is being corralled in a certain way. There are working women as well out on the city streets. I mean, when we talk about women not having the right to be alone on the streets, we're talking about a certain kind of middle class or upper middle class woman who has a reputation to protect. Working class women, of course, also had reputations to protect, but they weren't as under threat from coming and going between work and home as, a middle-class woman. You could look at, I'm trying to remember the name of it, there's a really wonderful George Sand novel about these lorettes, they were called, Lorette, like kind of lower middle class or working class young women who worked as seamstresses or in factories and were sort of like these, I don't know, if you think of like the 1920s in Paris being full of these flappers or young girls who were sitting and smoking and drinking in the cafes, the Lorette or the Midinette or the version of that, 100 years earlier, who George Sand writes about in this novel that I'm totally blanking on. I think it has like a man's name, like Horatio. Oh, Horace, that's it.
Oh,
Horace.
well done.
So anyway, they do exist, they are there, and they are worried about their reputations as well. But they do have slightly more access to the city streets than women of a higher rank or something.
Mm-hmm. There's a lovely incident you talk about referring to Virginia Woolf, sort of identifying Tavistock Hotel, the current Tavistock Hotel, as the place where Woolf entertained in her garden. Good flâneuse must bring a mind furnished with literary and social history, with feeling for people and places of the past, and obviously a good imagination too. And it seems to me that you had to know the place
Yeah, exactly.
before you could come up with that vision or that observation that describes what a flâneuse would do.
Yeah, exactly. I spent so many years reading Virginia Woolf and her diaries and her essays and obviously the novels, that I had almost a kind of imaginary London in my mind as a result of that. So, spending time in real London, it's like you just go to your point of reference, which is, Tavistock Square, of course, this is where Woolf lived and where her building was bombed. And she talked about, in this letter to Ethel Smythe, seeing like the kind of outline of her living room where she had so many parties and wrote so many books with like the facade torn off of it. So yeah, I think there are these images that you have just like indelibly marked in your mind, and that becomes almost the way that you see the city, like through that lens. It's hard to go to Venice without a very specific idea of it from like movies and books and poetry.
The Death in Venice, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We go
both
to
the
Venice
movie and the book.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
We just hear Mahler when we turn up in Venice, and it's very hard to get to the city like behind that or apart from that. But actually, maybe it's not that important to see the. I mean, this is what I wrote about in my Venice novel, the sort of attempt to like get off the beaten path as like ultimately impossible, because the whole city is one big beaten path. And what does authenticity even mean in a place that's been so trodden and poured over? And maybe maybe what is so wonderful about living in a city like that or visiting a city like that is enjoying the interplay of all these references and the fact that we hear them all when we step off the boat.
To be a good flâneuse, you need strong legs, erudition, and as we said, imagination, and to be in touch with ghosts.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the strong legs part, that's like not necessary. But I think you do need an active imagination and yeah, the willingness to see the city as more than just like, I think Jonathan Raban makes a really nice distinction between the hard city and the soft city. The hard city being like the buildings and the bollards and the sidewalks and, you know, the stuff, the built environment. And then the soft city is what I was just talking about, like the fact that you see Tavistock Square through the lens of having read Virginia Woolf's letters and the sense that it's a city built out of experience or affect, like a kind of affective engagement with the space of the city that is both created by the hard environment or the built environment, but also kind of goes beyond it and is changeable for you and different for me than it is for you. So yeah, I think that imagination or that kind of willingness to enter into the soft city is something that sadly not everyone has, but I think like if it's suggested to them, they might say, oh yeah, I guess there have been times when I've been daydreaming about this or that, you know, place in the city. So yeah, I think we get stuck into the humdrum of everyday life, and it's very understandable that, you know, people are preoccupied with more pressing matters than just like what might have happened on this city street. But I think that it is something that enriches your experience of the city and enriches that humdrum daily grind if you can tap into it.
I'm put in mind of the Woody Allen movie about Paris. Was
Midnight in Paris.
Scott Fitzgerald?
Yeah, both of them.
What did you think of that?
I have mixed feelings about that movie. It's definitely a feel-good movie. So in the opening sequence, he shows like different spots in Paris. I think like sepia-toned with like a jazz soundtrack, and he's just laying it out there. This is going to be a feel-good movie about like an engagement with the mythic whatever of Paris. But one of those early shots is of a movie theater at Odeon, and that's exactly the theater that I saw it in. So everyone in the theater went, oh my god, it's us, look, we're on the screen. It was such a weird meta moment. So there's, you know, I kind of love that movie because I love Paris for a lot of the reasons that, you know, Owen Wilson's character in the movie loves Paris, but it's also just such a selective, irritatingly selective view of Paris, and you know, I don't know, I have very mixed feelings about Woody Allen in general, since we're talking about, you know, the context of harassment. And I think he's like, I mean, worse than like Merchant Ivory ever has been in his like sycophantry of this, is that even a word, of like the wealthy. And I just never met anyone who talks or behaves like that girl's family in that film. So I don't know. I have obviously really, really mixed feelings about it. But I think that, you know, the like flashbacks to that imagined Paris of the 1920s are like really sweet and adorable. So yeah, there are nice moments, but on the whole, I find it suspect.
Well, he got funded by the city of Paris too.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. You've researched how women used cities as places of self-discovery, not female version of the flâneur as we've talked about, but more a subversive appropriation of urban space. So how do you use a city to discover yourself?
It's not so much a choice, so much as you just realize you're doing it. But how could you use a city to discover yourself? I think it either works for you or it doesn't. I think there are, you know, probably people living in cities that they don't particularly like and have no like way of moving anywhere else. And like, I don't know, hopefully like they can just make the most of it. But I don't know, if you're not really inspired by a place, I don't know how you could use that place to discover yourself particularly.
But if you are inspired, then so how does that help you discover who you are?
I think there's something about the like inherent fragmentation of the city, of the experience of the city, the way it's always different. There's always different things happening, different people coming and going. They can help you sort of confront the fact that we don't have unified selves. Like we ourselves are fragmented and different every day, and you know, we might have certain characteristics that carry us through our lives, but I find it very reassuring for example, the way that things are always changing in a city. I say that, I get really like crotchety and like frustrated in a really like reactionary kind of way when I walk around Paris and I see the whole thing's becoming like a hipster fairyland, and you're like, enough with the metro tiles, enough with the Scandinavian wood. You know, I feel kind of nostalgic for the way it was, but at the same time I take great solace in the fact that things are changing all the time, and that's true of the city, and that's true, you know, as Baudelaire said, of the human heart. Like, he was lamenting the fact that the form of the city changes more quickly than the form of the human heart. But there's that sense that we're all changing together, and even if things feel very bad, there's always the next day, and there's always another version of you interacting with different people or different ideas or different books or a different street in the city. So I'm not sure if that is a kind of guide to self-discovery, or if it's just a guide for coping, but maybe there's some relationship between coping and self-discovery.
It's funny, listening to you speak there about change. It reminds me of the line about how men want women to stay the same and women want men to change.
Yeah, that's true. Both are wrong.
Life could be meaningful even if it was unhappy.
Oh, right, yeah. That's the Reese chapter, I think. Yeah.
So how did the city help you to understand this?
Oh God, that's so Paris specific, and it's also really specific to being like 20 years old. Not that I've gotten over that, like, you know, taste for melancholy, but yeah, I think Paris is a city that, as I write about in that chapter, really, like, I don't know, kind of stokes a kind of melancholic reflection. And where was it? It was in like The Guardian a couple of years ago or something. There was some sort of study that showed that French people were among the least happy in the world, and France saw that and like shrugged, and they were like, who says we have to be happy? Like, why is happiness like the great goal? And I think you feel that living in Paris, that, you know, happy, it sounds like something that like a child's word, like happy, like who wants to be happy?
Well, that's what America's about, isn't it? The
Yeah,
pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think Paris is about the pursuit of like pleasure, which you can hopefully access even if you're not particularly happy. Like a good bottle of wine or walking by the Seine has its own kind of melancholic pleasure, even if you're feeling heartbroken or bereft. Obviously, there have been times in my life where I've been, you know, out of my mind with grief, and like walking in the street in Paris doesn't fix it. So we're not talking about like the outer edges of despair, but just a kind of post-breakup kind of melancholy, I think, is the kind of thing that Paris is like. It cradles, it makes you feel like it's okay, and that's just part of what life is. Life doesn't have to be one long succession of happy moments.
That's about change, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What's the difference between a voyeur and a flâneur?
That's a good question. I don't know that there is much of a difference. I wrote an essay a couple of years ago on how much I like to look in my neighbor's windows. And I don't think that there's anything necessarily creepy about that, as long as you're not, you know, doing it in some kind of sick way, or like filming them, or I don't know. I have this wonderful book here. I can't really see it, but it's all these amazing photographs of looking in. That's it. Gail Albert Halaban of Vis-a-Vis. And it's all these really beautiful photographs of looking in Parisian windows.
Right.
And she says in her introduction that she's like a happy voyeur or something. Like she's not trying to be a deviant or you know, take advantage of that.
She's not getting a sexual thrill off it.
Yeah, exactly. She's just like she's
curious.
Yeah, exactly. She's curious, and she has a goodwill towards these people. And I think actually these were, what's the word, staged. Like, these people know that they're being photographed.
Yeah.
But it does, you know, it's a very Parisian sort of thing, this vis-a-vis. Like, we have a vis-a-vis you see across the courtyard to those people. They always watch television on their massive, like, big screen TV, and it's really weird. So I never see them, I only see their TV. But yeah, I like that it's about companionability in the city. So I think, you know, voyeurism, it gets a bad rap.
It reminds me of Rear Window, the Hitchcock film.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Just got a few more questions for you. From architecture to literature to art, maleness is coded into the urban fabric. It's built for the height of men, not women. And women aren't allowed to make eye contact, don't talk back, it's not safe. That sort of covers what we were talking about, but it's still, it's not, you're saying that women now have sort of taken back the streets, but it's still not safe.
No, that's true. We can take back the streets like for a night, and then the next day it goes back to being as it was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people have asked me since the book came out, like, well, what can we do? Like, how can we make the city our own? How can we make the streets our own? I really don't know what to tell them. All I can say is I think it's awful that like women have to bear the responsibility for making sure they stay safe, that we have to like install apps on our phone to let our friends know we've gotten home, or carry around mace, or you know, clench our keys in our hand. I think that's ridiculous, but you know, I'm not sure there's anything we can do other than take these measures to protect ourselves. I think all we can do is talk about it and like raise awareness about it in the city. So
you talk about women being emotionally bound up in everything. What does that mean?
What do you mean? Where do I say that?
For women, perhaps walking in a city is being emotionally bound up in everything, a place to prove independence. I'm not sure where that comes from, but you did say that.
Yeah, I think probably what I meant is that we have something at stake walking in the city, and maybe sometimes we take it for granted, but you know, very quickly, if you're just sort of going about your business, someone will intervene in your bubble and make you aware of the fact that the city is not for you, the street is not for you, that it's for them or for their show of power. And yeah, I think that it's very difficult not to be on some low level bound up emotionally with the environment when you feel that there are people who want to sort of take your, I don't know, burst your bubble or threaten your safety or remind you of where you are in the hierarchy of the street.
I know we've talked a lot about being a flâneur, but how do you flân a city? Like, how would you go about, you know, if someone's listening to you and you get excited about the concept, so how do you go about doing that?
Well, I think there are probably two main schools of thought. One would be the kind of wandering at random school of thought. The other would be this kind of situationist style dérive, where you could sort of drift aimlessly, or you could set yourself a course where you say, I'm going to turn right every third right and then every second left and go in every shop that has an X in the title or something like that. You could make it really planned. Or like Ian Sinclair did this sort of in London Orbital, he walks around the ring road. Is it the M25? There's a big ring road around London and he walks it. Will Self's sort of directed walk from Heathrow to his walk from London to New York City, where he walks to Heathrow and then he walks from JFK to Manhattan. So I think that those are more structured experiences of flâning in the city, but I think they're still like, even if you put a shape around it, you're still opening yourself up to everything that could happen, you know, all of the things ways that you could
but you never know what's going to happen,
built environment. Right? Yeah,
exactly. You can structure it to some extent, but
yeah, and then you're leaving the rest up to chance. But then you're filling in that blank with like whatever there is to see or to look at or to notice. And I think both Ian Sinclair and Will Self are thinking about these kinds of structured walks as like a form of social critique or, you know, capitalist critique.
Mm-hmm. So what about taking photographs of stuff you see? Is that part of it?
Yeah, I do that. I'm a big fan of photographing the city. I have an Instagram account, and I think that having Instagram actually and this little camera on my phone has made me a better flâneuse. Like it's made me that much more attuned to the environment and to interesting like places and people and I don't know, just like corners or buildings that have something written on them. It's this sense of like that would make an interesting photograph, or you know, that would be interesting to show people.
Well, that's the thing about Instagram. It is showing other people, isn't it? You're not just taking these photographs for yourself.
Yeah, you're
sharing with other people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just another form, I think, of being an artist flâneur or an artist flâneuse.
What about other contemporary writers? You mentioned Will Self and Ian Sinclair. Anyone else that's sort of in the field?
I'm trying to think. There's a lot, but I'm sort of blanking on them. I have a good footnote. I'll refer to my footnote. This is actually meant to be in the introduction, and then it's just a list of names, and so my editor made me cut it, and I said okay, but I'm keeping it as a footnote, so I'll read it.
Sure.
I counter Guy Debord with his ex-wife Michelle Bernstein. I counter Ian Sinclair with Rachel Lichtenstein, she's great. Will Self with Laura Oldfield Ford. Nick Papadimitriou with Rebecca Solnit. Teju Cole with Joanna Kavanagh, but Patti Smith, Adrian Piper, Lisa Robertson, Faiza Gen, Janet Cardiff, Yoko Ono, Laurie Anderson, Vivian Gornick, Lavinia Greenlaw, Amina Kane, Chloe Regis, Atia Faizi, Heather Hartley, Wendy McNaughton, Danielle Dutton, Jermaine Kroll, she's no longer with us, but the rest of these people are contemporary, Valeria Luiselli, Alexandra Horowitz, Jessie Fawcett, Virginie Despentes, Kate Zambrino, Joanna Walsh, Eliza Gregory, Annie Youngno, Sandra Cisneros. Anyway, it goes on and on. Bits. Rachel Whiteread, she's also really wonderful. I think that's it for the living people.
That'll do. And these are mostly writers and artists?
Writers and artists, yeah.
Yeah. Just finally, you are going to Liverpool?
I moved part-time to Liverpool last year because I took up a post at the university and hated it, so I quit. No, I didn't. It's lovely. Liverpool is lovely, and the university is fine, but I didn't like having a full-time teaching job because it left me no time to write. But my partner still teaches at Liverpool, so we will be back up in the north of England in like late January of next year.
And what was it like to be a Flaneuse in Liverpool? What did you come across?
I came across a lot of drunken men at all times of day, a lot of really angry people, but also I think Liverpool is a city that perhaps because it's smaller and because there's such a striking amount of Georgian architecture, it really makes you wonder, like, what are these buildings? How did they get there? Like, who paid for them? And Liverpool has kind of a redoubtable history as being one of the major slave trading ports. And there's a wonderful slavery museum in Liverpool that sort of details this history, and it's one of the like places that children in Liverpool get taken on field trips so that it sensitizes them to their environment. That said, where I was teaching at the University of Liverpool was in one of these Georgian mansions that was built by someone who got rich off the slave trade. And I said to my students one day, like, for example, we're sitting in the mansion of a major slave trader, and they were like, what? Like, no, really? And they're sort of looking around going like, oh, suddenly all this like lovely Georgian ornamentation starts to feel like suspect. Mm-hmm. So I think because it's smaller and because it's more unified in its architecture and its history, more so than Paris, I think Liverpool sort of makes you go like, okay, there is like one particular way of enslaving people and oppressing them that resulted in this city looking the way it does. So yeah, it's really instructive. I mean, obviously you can go to Paris and go to London and think about the ways in which these are beautiful cities that were built on the backs of, the poor and the enslaved. But Liverpool is a city that like really makes you think about that. And now Liverpool One. Do you know about Liverpool One? It's like massive mall in the center of the city. It just, it takes this conversation about who's getting rich off the backs of whom in a totally different direction. It's like also troubling.
Thanks very much for taking the time to talk today.
Oh, sure. Thanks for coming over to my house in Belleville.
I've been speaking with Lauren Elkin, who is, among other things, the author of Flaneuse, Women Walk the City in Paris, New York, Tokyo, Venice, and London, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in the United States.
And Shadow and Windus in the UK.
And what about Canada?
Who is it?
Was it
it's
Penguin?
Not, yeah, because there wasn't a specific Canadian deal, so I think it's just, I'm not sure if it's the UK publisher who distributed it there or the American one, but yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why they didn't make a specific deal with Canada.
It's the story of our lives.
Really? No.
Anyway, thanks again.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thank you.